Of all the issues the Pharisees had with Jesus, his activities on the Sabbath day seemed to bother them the most. There are 7 recorded miracles that Jesus performed on the Sabbath, all of them involving a healing, either physical or spiritual. Today, we're going to look at another instance where Jesus is accused of violating the Sabbath along with his disciples. But first, let's establish some context for the term Sabbath. God created everything that exists in 6 days, from the heavens and the earth to man and woman. He made it all in 6 days. But there's a 7th day included in the creation account. Genesis chapter 2 tells us, on the 7th day, God ended his work which he had done, and he rested. Then God blessed the 7th day and sanctified it, because in it he rested from all his work. So right off the bat, God leads by example and establishes a principle that 1 out of every 7 will be dedicated to resting from work. Later, while giving Moses the 10 Commandments, God gives some further commentary about this special day of rest, and he even gives it a name. Remember the Sabbath day, to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all of your work, but the 7th day is the Sabbath of the Lord your God. In it you shall do no work, for in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the seas, and all that is in them, and rested the 7th day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and declared it holy. Now let's fast forward about 1,500 years. By this point, the Jews had taken God's original commandment to rest from work on the Sabbath and created an exhaustive definition for what it meant to not work. The Sabbath had become anything but a day of rest, with hundreds of rules and regulations on exactly how to keep the Sabbath. Let's take a look at our passage. Jesus is walking through the grain fields with his disciples on the Sabbath. His disciples were hungry and began to pluck some heads of grain to eat. Well, when the Pharisees saw it, they said to him, "Look, your disciples are doing what is not lawful to do on the Sabbath." The Pharisees were clearly upset that Jesus' disciples were violating the law by harvesting grain on the Sabbath. But actually, there was no law prohibiting the plucking of grain in order to eat on the Sabbath. The law allowed for a person to take handfuls of grain from a neighbor's field to satisfy his immediate hunger. Only laboring for the sake of profit was against God's law. So a farmer could not harvest for profit on the Sabbath, but he could certainly glean enough grain to eat. The disciples were picking grain because they were hungry, not because they wanted to harvest the grain for a profit. Jesus builds a solid case for why his disciples are not in violation of the law. First, he brings up a story of King David. When he and his men became hungry while fleeing from Saul, the priests gave him the showbread, which was not lawful for them to eat. God did not punish David because his need for food was more important than the priestly regulations. Jesus was basically saying, if you're going to condemn me, you have to condemn David too. His point in referencing this story was not to condone disobedience to God's law, but to show that love is more important than ceremonial laws. Next, Jesus points out the hypocrisy of the temple priests, who by law had to make twice as many sacrifices on the Sabbath, which means the priests worked twice as much on the Sabbath. But God allowed it because the purpose of the Sabbath is to rest and to worship God. And their Sabbath work was both serving and worshiping God. So even though they technically broke the Sabbath, they were guiltless before God. Then Jesus quotes the prophet Hosea, along with a direct challenge to the Pharisees' understanding of Scripture. Jesus rebuked the Pharisees for not knowing something that they should have known with his statement, "If you had known what this means." The verse Jesus cites is Hosea 6:6, which points out that the law's moral standards always take priority over its ceremonial requirements. The Pharisees tended to focus on the outward aspects of God's law and to neglect its inward intentions. In doing so, they became rigid, judgmental, and self-righteous in their views of others. Finally, Jesus makes his main point. His entire argument has been building towards his final statement. For the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. Jesus has referenced a king, a priest, and a prophet. His final words reveal his motive in the argument. Jesus is identifying as the King of Kings, the great high priest, and the prophet of God. But not only that, he is Lord of all, including the Sabbath. Jesus is claiming deity with his final argument. By claiming to be Lord over the Sabbath, Jesus is implying that he is the creator of the Sabbath. And if Jesus is the creator of the Sabbath, then he's also the creator of everything else. His final argument to the Pharisees was that the creator is always greater than the creation. And therefore Jesus had the authority to overrule their traditions and regulations. I think sometimes we too can miss the point of what Jesus was trying to communicate to the Pharisees. It's easy to become rigid and dogmatic in some of the ways we view biblical principles like the Sabbath. We can become so focused on certain traditions and regulations that it can affect how we view others who may violate them. No matter how pure our initial motivations are, may we never become like these Pharisees and focus more on outward and ritualistic tradition than inwardly seeking the true heart of God behind the tradition.